Okay, well, let me introduce you to my audience. Everybody, this is Isaac Saul. He is the inventor and proprietor of a new type of news called Tangle News. And let's just ask him what it is. Isaac, what is Tangle News?
So, Tangle News is a creation of mine that is meant to address some of the political polarization that we have in the media today. Ideally, and sort of the central focus of the newsletter is to make sure that people are being exposed to political views that they may disagree with. I learned from being a political journalist and an opinion columnist that my writing was received not based on the argument I was presenting or the evidence I was presenting, but almost exclusively evaluated on where it was being published. So if I wrote something that was put in the Huffington Post, then conservatives would not take anything I said at face value. If I wrote something that was published in Fox News, then liberals would not take anything I said at face value. And so I came up with this format, which is essentially what DC is talking about, what's today's topic, the main story with just some really baseline, very non-controversial descriptions of, what's going on in the world today. So if it's the Afghanistan withdrawal, where troops are moving, what's happening, what we know from the last 24 hours, and then what the right is saying, what the left is saying, and then my take.
And sometimes you reverse that to what the left is saying, what the right is saying. In fairness, I've noticed you do that. You alternate those. So so basically you give an overview of what the story is that Washington is talking about, that the world is talking about in the political sphere. And then you tell what the right is thinking about it from a right standpoint, and then from a left standpoint. And then you break it down yourself. And I was talking to a friend about this, and I was saying, I don't know where he stands. I'm thinking maybe a little center right. And the friend immediately said, I think a little center left. And I think, well, that's a job well done then. If we can't really tell, if you're, and I think one of the outstanding things is that having been on the left myself, sort of grew up as a default Democrat in California, and then gradually shifted further right as I got older. I've been on both sides of the thing, and I would know a false representation of the other side if I was reading it, and it doesn't read that way at all. It's a very fair. You're not just saying what the wildest idea of the other side is or each side is, and then that would give you lots of juicy stuff to talk about. You actually give the reasonable. Sometimes you might give a little bit of a wild thing, but just for balance. But how do you do that? Do you read a lot of each side?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I thank you, by the way. I could not come up with a kind of a higher compliment for what I'm trying to do, because my observation is that the tactics the left and the right each use is to elevate the loudest and the dumbest sounding people on the other side in order to make them seem representative of that worldview. So to answer your question, yeah, I consume a ton of news. I consume a ton of political news from the right and left. And when I put together the newsletter, I'm trying to do a few things. I mean, I'm evaluating, is the argument compelling? Does it make me think? Does it challenge some prior worldview I have? Does it, sort of give me pause? Right. Is it representative? Do I see a lot of people, a lot of columnists on the right or left making this argument, and I'm seeing some through line? Mm-hmm. And then, are the arguments speaking to each other, which is sort of the last thing. I want the newsletter to be cohesive. I think one thing that happens a lot is people, arguing about immigration, and one side's talking about what to do with undocumented immigrants in the country, and the other side's talking about whether we should allow green cards to be procured to Mexicans or something. And it's like, right, these are two different issues. So that's sort of like how I think about what to pick. But yeah, it involves reading and listening to an extraordinary amount of political commentary from across the spectrum.
Yeah, and a little later in our meeting, I'm going to dig into topics from the last 2 days of Tangle News, the essay that you published this morning, which was outstanding, and you getting into the vaccine mandates. But we're going to hold off a little bit of that. So if anybody's interested in that stuff, please stay with us, and that'll illuminate some of the points you just made. It's so strange and dangerous to be in a country where the very source of information is the biggest threat to the republic. I mean, if you listen to Democrats speak, they will say that the Republicans are an existential threat to the democracy, and on the other side, the hard right commentators will say that the Democrats are an existential threat to the republic. Really, it's the news that's the problem, isn't it? That we can't trust the news.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I've seen. I mean, I absolutely believe that the quote unquote mainstream press, however you want to put it, has damaged its credibility in really substantial and obvious ways by misreporting a lot of stories, by allowing personal bias to infect the reporting that they do and the story selection that they do. And I think people generally are, I would probably point the finger at social media before I pointed it at the actual source of the news. So I'm more worried about the distribution almost, because there's no doubt that there are, partisan hacks at the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and Fox News and everywhere across the spectrum. But what seems to be the issue is that people are so easily surrounding themselves with those partisan hacks that reinforce their own political views without ever getting exposed to the kind of content or arguments or thoughts that might challenge their priors. I mean, I think the best way to illustrate that is if you're talking to a liberal who is someone that reads the New York Times and considers himself well-versed in, political news, is asking them if they can articulate the conservative perspective on a certain issue. And I find most of the time they can't. They can tell me, maybe what Charlie Kirk or Candace Owens thinks or some other conservative provocateur that is, getting millions of retweets trying to intentionally trigger people. But they have a harder time telling me, the Wall Street Journal editorial board perspective, or, it doesn't even have to be a kind of establishment Republican view, even political columnists at American Greatness or the American Spectator or whatever, who are, have maybe a more fleshed out and consistent ideological stance on something. They don't get exposed to that. And I think the reason they don't is because social media and the political circles we surround ourselves in kind of insulate us with views that we are comfortable with and that we like. And that's part of what I'm hoping Tangle can do, is expose people to some of the ideas that they don't normally see when they're scrolling around on the internet.
And if you have somebody who's going to sort of aggregate that for you, that person has to be a really honest broker. And I think that's what you really have going for you with Tangle, is the fact that you really are an honest broker. And so I often find myself skipping ahead and reading your thing first, and then I'm going, well, now I got to go back and read both those things because you're referring to them, and now I have to go back and figure them out. It's not. I'm reading the whole thing through, is what I'm saying, but sometimes I want to fast track it, just get your opinion. And I'm sort of then ignoring what you're trying to do there. So I'm forcing myself to read both sides. But I found myself as having a conservative channel. We started getting a lot of views, and therefore, these people became my friends, and I liked them, and I'm getting some positive attention. And we never had any idea that we would, get, hundreds of thousands of views for, basically giving our opinion. And so I would find myself, when I was researching a story, I'd get to something that wasn't affirming what I hoped to find, and I'd skip to something else until I found something affirming me. And I go, well, that's not reporting. That's just that I'm selecting consciously, you know, and so I had to really check myself all the time that I wasn't putting it. And very often stories would disappear before my eyes because what I already had my theory, and I was just looking for somebody to confirm that theory. And if it wouldn't confirm the theory, I just had to throw the whole piece away. And
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to acknowledge that. And the thing I say to people often is, take the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, two newspapers that have some of the most well-paid and experienced reporters in the country, and they can report on the exact same event, and the two stories will look entirely different. And it's not because they're not honest brokers. It's not even, they're not trying to deceive anyone. I think those straight news reporters are intending to do good work. They just have different sources. They have different biases. They have different editors. They have all these things that play into this. So, unless you go out seeking out those other sources and looking for these different lenses to view things through, you're just not going to get exposed to it. And that's sort of what's so dangerous about the moment we're living in.
it really is. And, human beings, our elegant adaptation is we are the storytelling monkey. We're the storytelling ape. And we really like stories. So we start gathering sort of facts and things like that. We want them to tie together into a narrative that has villains and heroes and drama and conflict. And you can't always get a satisfactory amount of that by just reading up the news. So people have figured out ways to tie all the things they're saying day to day, be it on their AM radio talk show or be it on their daily YouTube podcast or whatever, to keep the story going. And then the story captures a certain type of audience, and then in turn that audience captures them. And now they've got this whole appreciative audience. A great example of this audience capture phenomenon is Scott Adams, who's always called himself to the left of Bernie Sanders. But he didn't criticize Trump for everything he did, and he credited Trump with some things, if only his skill as a persuader. And before he knew it, he had this YouTube audience made up almost entirely of conservatives. And now he has to be very careful not to offend the conservatives because they'll just leave him, And the thing is, his liberal people left him right away to begin with when he started. And so he's kind of stuck. And I see him struggling with it. I watch him about once a week, and I see him struggling with that, with trying to be honest and knowing that if he does, he'll have much less influence in the world. And it's a hell of a thing to be stuck in.
It's really difficult. And he's certainly, one of many pundits and people in this space who are trapped in that mud because, the threat and the pressure there is very real. The incentives are very real when, you see how quickly a group of people can turn on a pundit or someone they once thought was, a reliable narrator. I mean, we saw it right after the election with people abandoning Fox News because they didn't think they were sufficiently, critical of the sanctity of the election and whether it went off without a hitch or not, and going to these other news networks. And, Fox hasn't ever really recovered from that. They still have some good nights, but they're still crawling their way back. And that's a, $100 million, $1 billion company. It's not just a YouTuber.
Yeah, I had the same experience here in my own small way. I looked at the election results, and I mean, as we know, the Democrats outnumber Republicans by about 5%. And then there's usually just a few points above that is the independents, and they're bigger, a little bit bigger than the Democrats, and a little bit much more bigger than the Republicans in terms of a group. But if you look at what the independents are made up of, they are lean left over lean right by also about 5%, maybe even more. So basically, Republicans are outnumbered, and you don't really need massive voter fraud to explain a defeat when you are the minority party. And the other side is historically motivated to get rid of this guy that they hate more than they've ever hated anybody. but my everybody on, most of my viewers wanted to hear that this was stolen. And I had to say that I didn't see any evidence of that. And I lost 10,000 subscribers over the next month. And lately, I've done a similar thing with the vaccine thing, where I've said I think these things are safe, and I think the people that are anti-vaxxing are basically just the stop the steal people, finally giving up on that and morphing all over, kind of almost en masse to the other thing. And goodbye to another 5,000 subscribers. So it's a hard thing to do, which brings me to the question: is there any way to be exciting and a moderate?
I think there is. And one of the things I say to people often is that, I don't view myself as a moderate. I'm not, I say that my politics are incongruent. It depends on what the issue is. I don't fit neatly into one political party. I'm very passionate about certain issues. And I'm less passionate about others. I'm not a moderate on police reform. I'm not a moderate on free speech. Those are like, two issues where I have extremely charged and ideological and strong political views. And I'm transparent about that with my readers. It happens that my views in today's sort of political dichotomy are split. I think people would probably describe my views on police reform as very left, and my views on free speech as very right, in just the way that the narratives have broken up in today's political world. But I think the issue is, when you have something you care about, you need to write about it and address it like you care about it. And the great thing about being politically moderate, if that is what you are, is that you can be a little bit unpredictable. I mean, I read a lot of pundits every day, and I mostly, before I open, if I'm looking at the byline and paying attention to whose story I'm clicking on, I could probably guess where they're going to fall, on an issue. I can figure out what Paul Krugman's going to write in the New York Times about the economy on any given day before I read the article, because his ideological process and framework is so predictable at this point. And I actually find that kind of boring. Now, I understand, there are ways to be partisan or not moderate and also be very exciting. I mean, Tucker Carlson, I think I would not describe as a moderate, but he's clearly captured a huge segment of the population with his political views. And I think part of that is because he's not entirely predictable. He will sometimes take stances that are sort of surprising to people.
Well, for example, when Trump drone striked Soleimani, Tucker's hair was on fire for a few days, thinking that we were heading into World War III. And that was not a popular thing to say. So he went out on a limb with that, didn't he?
Definitely. And I think that's the kind of unpredictability that I think a lot of people appreciate about him. And so, to answer your question, I guess more directly, I think being a moderate pundit or a political person and being interesting is possible, but it requires being really principled, and it requires being honest about your mistakes and your biases, and it requires acknowledging the kind of views that are maybe less moderate from across the political spectrum and addressing them. And I think more and more Americans are seeking out some moderation. I think we've I don't know if we're quite there yet, but I think during the Trump era, a lot of people maxed out on, how much partisan punditry they could tolerate and handle, and how far they could go. And people are tired, and they want to be informed and engaged. They don't want to be exhausted and horrified by the news. And I think that's the appeal of maybe people like me, who I think are trying to turn the temperature down a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to is what kind of audience are you managing to speak with, and does your audience demand that you be a little bit of a showman as you give the news? I first was introduced to you on a podcast that I watched where you and Matt Taibbi were the guests, and I years ago stopped reading Matt Taibbi because I was, Rolling Stone was so turning not only just away from music and into sort of ads on every page commercialism, but very clearly on a left-wing thing at a time when I was moving to the right. And so I just sort of threw Matt Taibbi away with that because I had him identified with that. And he certainly has earned more respect than that, and I'm tuning back into him now and reading him. But in order to read Matt Taibbi, because he is a spicy writer, I've got to be prepared to go in there and hear some serious criticisms of people I have defended and voted for. And he really goes after them in his inimitable style. And I have to go, okay, I'm going to allow this gentleman, in order that I can hear his full take on things and also his historical perspective, which is valuable. I've got to allow this guy to not agree with me on everything. I'm not reading me, I'm reading him. And I have to go into there, but I have to brace myself a little bit because, I could be reading along and he's criticizing the right people for me. And all of a sudden he just whips back and, it socks me in the mouth, if I'm identifying with those people so strongly that he's criticizing. And this is something that it's gotten so that if you hear an actor criticize your person, you won't ever watch one of their movies again. That guy was sat on a bench instead of standing for the flag, and that escalated into, I'm never watching football again. You know what I mean? That's ridiculous to tie everything into the day-to-day vicissitudes of political debate. I'm going to lose the whole culture because somebody, that actor in that movie, votes differently than I do and speaks up about it like I do. No.
Yeah, totally. And I think too, one of the things that's interesting about that kind of political reaction is that it's sort of the evidence of, how the cancel culture, quote unquote, cuts both ways. It happens on the right and it happens on the left. And I'm sort of waiting for this sort of, a mutual mercy call from each side to say, let's stop this. Once we've all seen enough of our own heroes or idols fall victim to this, a recognition from everyone that maybe, we shouldn't be trying to destroy each other based on, one bad tweet or one inappropriate comment or one, political view held 2 decades ago that has gone out of style. And it's happening to everybody. It's, I think people should be allowed to have bad tweets when they were teenagers. And I think football players should be able to kneel if they want to kneel during the national anthem. And
it's a free country, we used to say.
Yeah, we used to say, yeah. And, it's interesting to see how we often, whether you're on the left or the right, we commit a lot of the same crimes against each other that we often can't claim to be the victims of. And cancel culture is really probably the number one example of that.
Well, I have been having, I sort of got cancel cultured on the left. I was a folk singer, and I'm a musician in the LA music scene, and it is pretty much, monolithically left wing. Particularly folk music, because it has this historical tie to the, the civil rights and the protest singers. Everybody's got a song that's a protest song, and every folk singer has one song sung in Spanish. They sort of like these touchstones that everybody does, and I just wasn't leaning in that direction so hard anymore. And I would sometimes speak out against it because Facebook was a thing I couldn't resist. I was making my opinions known, and I was getting attacked from the left. It's sort of, I got driven out of that camp, and the camp that took me in was, come hide behind us, was the Republicans, was the conservatives, and I kind of ducked into that camp, and I found myself defending Donald Trump, and now, because I haven't stayed pure, I haven't been past the purity test day to day. Now I'm getting cancel cultured over there, and but so I'm being very, very careful to, instead of looking at the endless attack comments that I get, I'm being very careful to look at the thumbs up or thumbs down. And that's still about 3/4 on my side. They're just they're not the kind that necessarily leave comments. I'm guessing. So I'm trying to find an audience where I can be honest and where they can sometimes go, well, I don't agree with you on this one, but hey, you have the right to say what you say.
Yeah, I think that's an important audience to grow. And one of the things I've found in my newsletter is that I often get the most praise from my readers and the most positive feedback when I'm copping to being wrong about something, going back to a piece of writing that I had maybe months before or a year before and revisiting it and saying I had this wrong, or I'm expressing that I've changed my views about something that I've written about before. And I'm trying to, model some of the behavior that I hope to see more in the political world, which is just like, people get it wrong sometimes. I've gotten it wrong. I've predicted things that I was totally wrong about. And I've also had my views change when I've seen more evidence that I hadn't encountered before on certain issues. And that, I think, doing that and demonstrating that is a really important, powerful thing for a lot of people.
Well, one thing I've noticed you doing is taking some deep breaths before you jump on that. And one of the problems with this clickbait new media model is everybody's got to get on it that day with an opinion. Now, how do you get an opinion unless you've spent a few days with it, even slept on it? I write complete essays and I sleep on them, wake up the next morning and go, what was I thinking? Sometimes I'm just writing and I'm so enjoying the idea, the spinning out. I'm not really testing it against, is it really a good idea so much as it is a good idea to write about. And, the stuff will just flow out and I'll look at it the next morning and I go, I got to throw this thing away because it's unsupportable. And I'm just so glad that I didn't throw it out there that day in order to try to keep up with that news cycle. But that is the temptation. And the guys that have the big channels, they do that. Something happens this morning, they're going to have an opinion on it in an hour.
Yeah, it's not good. I don't think it's a healthy way to have a discourse. And I think everything you just said are feelings that I've experienced as a writer, fleshing out an opinion and following it and taking it to its logical conclusion and then sitting on it and coming back to it the next day and going like, oh shit, this is not like I landed somewhere, I dug my own grave on this and I don't agree with where I'm at now. But the worst part about that dynamic you're talking about the way it gets churned out is that once it's published, the instinct is to defend it. And so that once they're there, then it's like, then they have to rationalize it. Even if there's that voice or they know somewhere in their heads that maybe they got it wrong, it's out there. And it's a lot easier to turn your head a little bit and change the view on it and find ways to defend it against the criticism than it is to just stand up and say, you know what, I pumped this out too quick and I've seen some other things that made me second guess my opinion.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel and then click the little bell to get notifications.